Carlson.
From Luke 9. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. Then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among you all who is the greatest." "Master," said John, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he is not one of us." "Do not stop him," Jesus said, "for whoever is not against you is for you." As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading to Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven and destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. As they were walking along the road, a man said to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Jesus said to another man, "Follow me." But he replied, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Still another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." And Jesus replied, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." The word of the Lord.
Classic to the Peanuts comic strip is Lucy holding a football like a place kicker for Charlie Brown. Every time Charlie charges forward to kick the ball, she picks it up at the last second, and Charlie kicks the air instead and falls flat on his back. One day, Lucy begged Charlie to try again, saying, "Charlie Brown, I've been so terrible to you over the years, picking up the ball like I have. I have played so many cruel tricks on you, but I've seen the error of my ways. I've seen the hurt look in your eyes when I've deceived you. I've been wrong, so wrong. Won't you give a poor penitent girl another chance?" Convinced by her emotional appeal, the ever-dutiful Charlie Brown says, "Of course I'll give you another chance." Lucy holds the ball. Charlie steps back to get a running start. At the last second, she picks up the ball and Charlie Brown falls flat on his back. Looking over him, she says, "Recognizing your faults and actually changing your ways are two different things, Charlie Brown." Well, in our recent study of Ephesians, we recall how Paul charged his readers that the gospel once received must be lived out. Having accepted and been forgiven by God's grace, we must start to reflect God's character in our lives. As we just sang, we could hold on to who we are and never let the Lord change us from the inside. We must not only recognize our faults and old patterns of life, but change them by taking on a new life, the life of Jesus. There may be years of distrust, habitual anger, materialism, lust, you name it, that's inside of us that must be dealt with. They're not going away unless we address them with God's help. And just like any habit and pattern, you have to do make a change for an extended period of time before it truly takes hold. The most important thing in our life is not measured by what we've done to earn a living or the achievements or accomplishments we've racked up in our lifetime. The most important thing is who we've become. That is what distinguishes us and what we take with us into eternity. A disciple, an apprentice, is someone who has decided that the most important thing in her or his life is to learn how to do what Jesus said. I think Luke's arrangement of chapter 9 offers some lessons on being a lifelong learner of Jesus. The first one I would point out is what it means to emulate the nature and character of Christ means that we treat everyone with dignity, honor, and respect. Not only those who belong within our fellowship, but the same applies to those outside it. As observed, the disciples valued Jesus' status as God's redemptive agent, but they could not make sense of or connect his words about his impending suffering. If we do not understand Jesus' identity and the manner of his mission, we're not going to understand our own discipleship. On the heels of hearing what awaits Jesus in Jerusalem, they're debating who's the greatest. You might think it's comical if it's not so tragic. Now, I doubt that they're ranking each other 1 to 12, like where am I in being great in relationship to Jesus. No doubt what they're doing is debating who among the inner circle of Jesus, Peter, James, and John, is the greater. This might be how the prevailing culture assesses a person's relative status or standing within a given group, but it's not the way in the kingdom of God. Ever patient to help his followers learn, Jesus provides them with an object lesson. He places a child in a position of honor at his side. Then he tells them that God's way of evaluating a person's worth differs drastically than that of the Greco-Roman culture. The practice of welcoming someone means to honor that person, usually of equal status or greater than one's own. But no one would make such an effort for a child. They had no standing in first century society, nor were they considered to be persons of consequence or significance. Jesus upends their criteria of evaluating others and demonstrates that in the kingdom of God community, everyone is valued, especially the weak, the vulnerable, the unseen. To welcome and honor them is to welcome Jesus himself. To act in any other way is inconsistent with the character and actions of God. And the same applies to those whom we might consider outside the community. John asked Jesus whether a person who is not part of the core group should be using his name to do ministry. We don't know if this person is in the larger company that's following Jesus or whether they're out on the fringe working independently. Either way, John presents a boundary of separation and points out that this person lacks the proper authorization to be serving in this way. And Jesus rebukes him. He reiterates that the same welcome and honor should apply to those outside their fellowship. The second lesson I see in this passage is that of being an apprentice requires us to be intentional and determined, since the journey of the one we follow is not without cost. In verse 51, the second half of 51, Jesus, in the NIV it says, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. In the New Revised Standard Version it says, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. In the Message, Eugene Peterson paraphrases it as, he gathered up his courage and steeled himself. Some scholars translate this as a Hebrew figure of speech, which refers to a person being commissioned and dispatched with a message of judgment. It's reminiscent then of the message of the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, who had predicted the downfall, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. And in this way, Jesus is acting similarly by predicting the same, only a few dozen years after his death. But other scholars argue this phrase could simply mean a determination to do something. I think this is how it most applies to us. To be a follower means we journey with Jesus to Jerusalem, knowing it is not easy, and it includes a prospect of rejection and hostility leading to death. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's classic work, The Call to Discipleship, reminds us that there is a cost to following Jesus. When Christ calls a person, he says he bids him come and die. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing, happy life, though. It meets us at the beginning. As we embark upon this journey, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. And then we take up our lives. We take up his life. So we must measure what is the true cost. That is, what is lost versus what is gained. You may recall Jesus told two parables, one of a man who found a pearl of great price, and the other who found a treasure in a field. In each case, the person sells everything they have in order to obtain what was of greater value. They're not complaining about the cost, but they're excited and eager to gain what they consider to be of ultimate value. One does not enter God's kingdom by complaining. Counting the cost helps us open ourselves to receive and learn, to see the superiority of what we receive over everything else we once thought valuable. The third lesson is that we need not defend Jesus when our own religious sensibilities are offended. I recently had this happen. An organization I belong to sent out something about Christmas, and they wanted to honor all the other traditions. And so they're talking about Hanukkah and its historical relevance and how it's practiced in Judaism. They talked about a Japanese tradition and how that's practiced, and Kwanzaa and how it's practiced. And then they came to Christmas and they talked about Santa Claus and gift giving. And I just wanted to go, okay, you said you didn't want to offend anyone. You wanted to be inclusive, but I'm incensed. That was what happened with James and John. They've been with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. They feel euphoric. They feel their own importance. They might have stirred up the debate as to who's the greatest. So when Jesus doesn't receive a welcome in Samaria, they say to him, shall we call down fire like Elijah and just consume them all? If they're not going to welcome you, then wipe them off the face of the earth. And Jesus reminds them that he is loving and gracious. He represents God's work to not seek vengeance and punish, but instead to call those who are overlooked and least likely to enter God's kingdom. In my own being incensed and debating whether to write a letter to the organization I described, I found this quote of Dallas Willard to be very convicting. One of the hardest things in the world is to be right and not hurt other people with it. So I had to ask myself, would I write to this person who wrote that letter and tell them they were wrong, that they didn't accomplish their objective, or do I rest with it and let it be? I don't need to defend Jesus. He's fully capable of defending himself. What I need to do is focus on how to live more like him and how to be more like him. The last piece of lesson for this lesson, I refer to the Franciscan priest and author Richard Rohr, who said this: "It has always been much easier to worship Jesus than to follow him. We think worship is rather harmless and without risk, but following Jesus changes everything." And that's the point of the 3 vignettes at the close of this chapter, where Luke ties them together in order to emphasize the demands of discipleship and the challenge of following the direction and path of Jesus. The first candidate makes an eager and unconditional offer to follow Jesus anywhere. But Jesus reminds him that nature provides housing for foxes and birds, but shelter for people is a matter of human effort and hospitality. The eager applicant is told he is about to throw in his lot with a cause that is soon to become unpopular. Jesus' call to another candidate is met with qualification. The man says yes to following Jesus, but asked to defer his start, kind of like a gap year. He asked to defer his start until after he fulfills one of the most sacred and binding duties of his life, that of burying his father. And Jesus' reply is startling. His words, "Let the dead bury the dead," sounds harsh, if not offensive. But the stark contrast makes the point. Even the most pressing life matter, which fulfills the duty to honor a parent, is secondary to Jesus' call to follow him and announce God's kingdom. Jesus takes precedence over everything. The third encounter is reminiscent of the prophetic call of Elijah to become a mentor of Elijah. He too is plowing a field at the time, but before he joins the prophet and assumes the mantle, Elisha goes to his family to secure their blessing. By comparison, the presence of the kingdom of God goes beyond anything Elijah would experience. The challenge to journey with Jesus, to keep moving forward, comes through loud and clear. No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom. In each of these vignettes, there is no place for hesitation or delay. The call of Jesus involves risk. It is costly. It takes priority and precedence over all other obligations or family bonds. I am never more humbled than when I attend a Christian memorial service. And it's not just simply a matter of grieving the loss of a loved one or a family member. It's when we hear people speak of their memory and connect how the member of Christ's body was able to exemplify his character and what was cherished about that particular person. I've shared this story before, but in the church I first started attending as a Presbyterian, First Presbyterian Church of Fresno, the pastor there was Dr. Paul Pearson, who later became the dean of the School of World Mission at Fuller Seminary. The community lost a Dr. Gene McCarty in a tragic river rafting trip. And Paul was one of his closest friends and was in a covenant group with Dr. McCarty. So when he got up to talk about him, he simply put up his hands, and Paul has rather large hands at that, and he said, if this were the hand of Jesus and the life of Jesus, then Gene McCarty's life had so aligned with his that it was hard to differentiate the two. I'll never forget that. And we must ask ourselves then, where are we in relationship to that alignment? Another story happened here in this congregation, a memorial for Joy Gass. Her son, Will Gass, had a friend, Mark Emery, who had asked at an early age if he could sleep over. But there was a condition, according to Joy, that if he did so on a Saturday evening, he had to attend church here the next morning. And Mark shared how coming to this church was the event that led him to become a follower of Jesus. And in his tribute and his remembrance of his friend's mother, Mark said, she never had to convince me of God's presence or of God's love. She lived it. Her life was a model of the life of Christ. So, what it means to be an apprentice is that God is in my whole life, that he wants to be in all aspects of my living. He wants to transform me to be more like Jesus, to reflect him in this world. May it be so for all of us.